A pristine white bird flutters past a grand, sunlit balcony where a solitary figure watches from the shadows, firmly refusing an unspoken command. Standing defensively over a cowering woman, Prince Adelbert aggressively barks at her to keep her hands away. Yanking his intricately patterned royal cape from a deeply bewildered Faith Howard, the prince sharply voices his deep-seated disdain for women. Glaring down with a violently cold intensity, Adelbert ruthlessly declares that his bitter past experiences have proven that innocent-looking women are nothing but practiced liars. Unmoved by her fragile, trembling appearance, he sneeringly guarantees she will inevitably expose her true, deceitful colors soon enough. The prince's icy, narrowed gaze remains locked in a hardened, unforgiving stare. Staring back with wide, panic-stricken eyes, a stunned Faith desperately questions why he would hurl such cruel, baseless accusations when they have only just met. Despite her elegant bridal attire, Faith secretly carries the burdensome, humiliating reality of being the penniless daughter of a lowly viscount. Softening his harsh tone slightly to offer a rigid formal apology, Adelbert bitterly explains that his royal duties and high status left him with absolutely no choice but to remarry. Casting his weary eyes downward in bitter resignation, he ruthlessly crushes her hopes by vowing he will never truly consider her his actual wife. Thus begins a desperately bleak chapter in Faith's life, officially marking the dawn of the absolute worst contract marriage imaginable. The narrative abruptly shifts backward by 2 entire weeks, landing on a busy city street where scandalous news heavily dominates the morning headlines. An enthusiastic paperboy eagerly hawks the latest addition to bustling cafe patrons, shouting at the top of his lungs about Prince Adelbert's shocking 4th divorce. The freshly printed broadsheets viciously dissect the prince's rapidly unraveling reputation, aggressively noting that his previously sterling character is now heavily scrutinized by the masses. A deeply exhausted Adelbert glares silently into the distance, fully aware that a 4th failed marriage spells catastrophic damage to his fragile public image. Autumn leaves drift sorrowfully across the grand, imposing stone gates of the royal castle. Seated stubbornly in the quiet shadows of his study, the fiercely defiant prince vows aloud that he will never subject himself to the endless torment of marriage again. An older, fiercely determined royal advisor stands resolute before the prince's cluttered desk, completely unwilling to accept his ruler's obstinate refusal. Leaning forward aggressively, the royal aide passionately scolds Adelbert, forcefully insisting that his ongoing marital failures have ballooned into an unprecedented national crisis. Waving off the prince's political confidence, the frantic advisor explains that an unwed royal sparks severe public anxiety and completely ruins essential diplomatic appearances. The political situation rapidly deteriorates as malicious whispers suggest the previous queen fled in terror because she could not stand the prince's alleged bizarre intimacies. Pinching the bridge of his nose in profound exasperation, Adelbert reluctantly concedes that these highly damaging, salacious rumors present a severe problem for the crown. Seizing the rare moment of royal weakness, the overbearing advisor aggressively slams a thick stack of candidate profiles onto the desk, loudly demanding an immediate bride selection. Adelbert sighs heavily under the immense pressure, his gloved hands aimlessly flipping through the seemingly endless parade of potential, politically viable brides. Hiding his exhausted face behind the scattered documents, the prince cynically mutters that every single candidate will ultimately lead to the exact same disastrous outcome anyway. Suddenly, a specific photograph catches his critical eye, instantly piercing through his thick veil of royal apathy and capturing his full attention. The opulent, sprawling castle swiftly fades into the distant, rustic serenity of the mountainous Howard territory. Inside a remarkably modest country home, Faith and her visibly stressed parents stand completely frozen in total, unadulterated disbelief. Her heart pounding wildly in her chest, Faith stares blankly as she struggles to process the world-shattering news that Prince Adelbert has officially proposed to her. A dignified royal messenger respectfully confirms the monumental offer, strongly emphasizing that it was a deeply personal, specific request from the crown prince himself. Gripping her collar in sheer panic, Faith stammers out a desperate, wide-eyed plea to know why the future king would ever choose someone as spectacularly insignificant as her. The deeply impoverished Howard family has survived for generations as mere figureheads, living a hardscrabble rural existence far closer to basic commoners than actual ruling nobility. As the elegantly dressed messenger kneels with the royal decree, Faith hesitantly voices a lingering, profoundly dark anxiety. Trembling with deeply buried shame, She anxiously wonders aloud if the royal court is fully aware of a highly scandalous rumor surrounding a disastrous incident from her past. Her traumatic memories instantly surge backward to a fateful trip with her hopeful parents, triggered by a highly coveted marriage proposal from a prestigious duke's family. The towering, breathtakingly opulent Patterson estate rises magnificently against the sky, serving as a stark, intimidating contrast to Faith's undeniably humble origins. A flawlessly groomed, remarkably handsome nobleman greets her warmly, his charming smile perfectly masking a deeply sinister, underlying intent. A decadent, mouth-watering feast of roasted meats and pristine desserts is laid out across the dining table, heavily symbolizing the massive wealth and high stakes of the evening. Bathed in warm, romantic light, an innocent Faith smiles joyfully, completely unaware of the devastating catastrophe looming just around the corner. The meticulously planned dinner party rapidly derails from its smooth, celebratory trajectory into a complete, inescapable nightmare. Faith's joyful expression violently shatters into horrified confusion as she searches the grand, labyrinthine halls of the estate. Her elegant gown rustles sharply as she stops dead in her tracks, utterly paralyzed by a sickening, undeniable discovery. Stumbling into a secluded lounge, she catches her supposedly devoted fiancé lounging arrogantly on a sofa, fully surrounded by a flock of overly affectionate women. Rather than showing remorse, the disgraced fiancé simply clicks his tongue in blatant, unapologetic annoyance, glaring fiercely at Faith and her horrified parents. Erupting in unwarranted, explosive rage, the nobleman viciously screams that he always deeply despised a pathetic, uncultured country girl like her. Leaning casually against the doorframe, he coldly reveals the entire engagement was a ruthless scam orchestrated by his greedy father to completely crush the Howard estate and steal their land for a factory. Drenched in cold sweat, Faith's fragile mind violently fractures under the crushing, unimaginable weight of his outrageous betrayal. The agonizing emotional shock instantly compounds with the suffocating, unbearable physical grip of a corset she had cinched far too tightly in her earnest determination to impress him. Utterly defeated and entirely unable to draw a single, desperately needed breath, Faith's tearful eyes flutter shut. Her exhausted body goes completely limp as she faints backward, collapsing heavily into the suffocating darkness of her completely ruined engagement. Reaching out in absolute terror, Faith's desperate parents scream her name as she plummets backward. The disgraced fiancé's father watches the unfolding disaster with wide, infuriated eyes. Flailing helplessly, Faith crashes hard onto the floor in her heavy floral gown. A heavy, suffocating silence immediately crashes over the stunned room. A sharp, sickening shatter suddenly pierces the quiet as an unseen object breaks upon her impact. Rushing to his daughter's side, Faith's frantic father cradles her head and desperately asks if she is injured. The towering nobleman's face twists into an expression of unadulterated, vein-popping rage. Clutching her face in sheer horror, the fiancé's mother shrieks that Faith has completely destroyed a priceless piece from the family's collection. A nightmare collage of malicious lies instantly overwhelms Faith, recalling how the arrogant family falsely branded her a promiscuous, destructive lowlife to justify extorting her estate. Snapped back to the present reality, a deeply anxious Faith admits she dare not defy a royal command but nervously wonders if the crown is completely blind to her ruined reputation. She casts her eyes downward, heavily burdened by the dark, inescapable shadow of her scandalous past. Maintaining a calm, professional demeanor, the royal messenger shocks her by confirming that Prince Adelbert is already intimately aware of the vicious rumors. Utterly aghast at the royal summons, Faith's mother violently grips her daughter and demands to know if she has completely lost her mind. Turning her back to her frantic parents, Faith stares quietly at the heavy wooden door. Glancing softly over her shoulder, she gazes warmly at her deeply impoverished, endlessly supportive mother and father. Speaking with quiet resolve, Faith addresses her parents to soothe their rapidly escalating panic. She solemnly reminds them of the immense, lingering suffering her disastrous broken engagement caused their struggling household a year ago. Pausing to gather her absolute resolve, she begins to outline her desperate strategy. Gripping her chest, Faith suggests that successfully marrying into the royal family might finally alleviate the crushing financial burden suffocating their people. Her delicate hand rests firmly against the edge of the table as she braces herself for the terrifying path ahead. Clutching the heavy royal scroll, Faith's sharp intuition screams that there simply must be a hidden catch to such a miraculous proposal. Tightening her grip on her own trembling hand, she aggressively pushes her lingering doubts aside. Standing tall with absolute conviction, Faith formally declares to the messenger that she will humbly accept this incredibly suspicious marriage. Newsboys enthusiastically flood the bustling streets of the Rise Kingdom, loudly hawking the latest scandalous extra edition. A stoic sketch of Prince Adelbert dominates the front page, proudly announcing his shocking 5th trip to the altar. The sensationalist headline ruthlessly targets Faith, gleefully revealing the new royal bride as the kingdom's rumored, infamous Villainess. Towering city buildings silently oversee the rapidly spreading gossip echoing through the cobblestone streets. The scene transitions to the breathtaking, sunlit facade of the royal cathedral where the fateful ceremony is about to commence. Looking impeccably sharp but emotionally distant, Prince Adelbert stands tall in his intricately decorated formal military regalia. A solemn, bearded high priest waits quietly at the grand altar, preparing to bind the unlikely couple in holy matrimony. Due to the deeply scandalous nature of the union, the sprawling cathedral pews remain embarrassingly empty, hosting only Faith's parents and a tiny handful of silent witnesses. His polished boots click sharply against the marble floor as the prince formally approaches the altar. Resplendent in a gorgeous, flowing white gown, Faith walks forward with a massive bouquet of roses, her expression a mix of beauty and profound sorrow. Guided firmly by her anxious father, the stunning bride slowly glides down the long, empty carpet toward her royal destiny. Gazing proudly at her daughter, Faith's mother tearfully whispers how incredibly beautiful she looks despite the deeply unconventional circumstances. The older couple whispers quietly among themselves, fully understanding that the shockingly sparse attendance is the direct result of this being the prince's 5th attempt at marriage. Standing shoulder to shoulder, the weary prince and the anxious bride finally unite at the front of the echoing church. Their wildly different worlds physically collide as Faith's delicate lace hem rests just inches from Adelbert's polished military boots. The ancient priest solemnly addresses Adelbert Rice and Faith Howard, formally initiating the sacred, high-stakes ceremony. Looking down at his heavy tome, the holy man begins reciting the ancient, unbreakable vows of the kingdom. Gently clasping their hands together, the priest formally demands to know if they vow to remain faithfully bound to one another. Faith looks up with melancholic, deeply uncertain eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable heartbreak. Adelbert returns her gaze with a fiercely intense, calculating stare that betrays absolutely none of his true emotions. Together, their voices echo through the empty cathedral as they simultaneously seal their fates with a binding agreement. Stepping back slightly, the priest warmly instructs the newlyweds to finalize their union by exchanging rings. A flawless, brilliantly cut diamond ring sparkles brightly upon the velvet presentation cushion. With surprising gentleness, the stoic prince carefully slides the heavy, magnificent jewel onto Faith's slender finger. Adelbert formally reaches forward to lift the delicate lace veil as his new bride bows her head in submissive anticipation. A dazzling, emotional montage captures the exact moment the veil parts and Faith's wide, hopeful eyes fully take in her new husband. Gazing up at Adelbert, Faith notes he looks infinitely more gallant and kind than his royal portraits, yet her guarded heart absolutely insists there is a dangerous catch waiting for her. A regal man gently places a magnificent, jeweled tiara upon the veiled head of his bride, initiating a union shrouded in suspicion as she silently senses there is far more to this marriage than meets the eye. Standing side by side yet emotionally worlds apart, the stoic groom gazes blankly ahead while the bride gently brushes away a lingering tear, her expression radiating a profound, quiet sorrow. Closing the distance between them, the impeccably dressed nobleman lifts his bride's chin with a gloved hand, forcing her to meet his intense, calculating gaze amidst a backdrop of delicate floral decorations. Leaning in with an air of practiced formality, the groom captures her lips in a gentle but passionless kiss, sealing their vows under a canopy of pristine, blossoming roses. Outside the opulent walls of the royal estate, an expectant murmur ripples through the gathered public as they eagerly await the appearance of the newly wedded couple on the grand balcony. A diverse sea of commoners, from wide-eyed children to weathered elders, presses tightly together, their faces illuminated with joyous anticipation as they crane their necks toward the towering palace. Meanwhile, inside a lavish dressing room, an anxious but radiant Faith Howard is meticulously attended to by her diligent maids as she remarks that the people have joyously gathered in the courtyard to celebrate. Beaming with genuine warmth, Faith cheerfully acknowledges her attendants' instructions with a bright, compliant affirmation, willingly accepting their polite request to wait just a moment longer while they diligently prepare for her grand presentation. Suddenly, the tranquil atmosphere is pierced by the authoritative, icy voice of her new husband, who sharply calls out her full name, Faith Howard, demanding her immediate attention. Towering over her with an intimidating presence, the royal asserts his dominance immediately, declaring forcefully that before proceeding, he must make one thing absolutely clear. He inherently does not trust women. Caught completely off guard by this sudden, hostile declaration on her wedding day, Faith spins around with wide, bewildered eyes, uttering a soft gasp of sheer disbelief. Shock rapidly morphs into profound exasperation as Faith, utterly flabbergasted by his sheer audacity, incredulously questions if this abrasive insult is truly the very first thing he intends to say to her. Unfazed by her righteous indignation, the royal turns his back to her, his cape swirling dramatically as he begins to coldly articulate his underlying fears regarding their newly minted union. Casting a chilling, sidelong glance over his adorned shoulder, he ruthlessly crushes any lingering romantic illusions by declaring with absolute certainty that he will never, under any circumstances, see her as his true wife. Delivering the final, devastating blow to her dignity, he cruelly reduces her entire existence to a mere political instrument, stating she is nothing more than a convenient tool utilized to preserve the royal family's fragile dignity. A heavy silence descends upon the room as Faith lowers her gaze, her earlier suspicions tragically confirmed as she internally reflects that she always inherently knew there was a significant catch to this prestigious arrangement. Desperation grips her trembling hands as she forcefully clutches the delicate fabric of her pristine wedding gown, acutely aware that her family and her people's very livelihoods are entirely riding on the success of this fraught marriage. Visualizing the warm, smiling faces of the humble villagers she fiercely protects, Faith mentally fortifies her resolve for the sake of everyone she loves, firmly replying with a singular, unwavering acknowledgement of her grim situation. Lifting her head with a remarkable display of unyielding aristocratic pride, Faith boldly meets his cruel gaze and loudly proclaims that she shall impeccably fulfill her assigned duty as a mere tool of the royal family. Her surprisingly fierce compliance momentarily halts the prince's relentless verbal assault, prompting him to pause and reassess this unexpectedly resilient woman standing before him. Seizing the conversational high ground, Faith boldly challenges his sweeping misogyny, reminding His Highness that while he kept complainingly saying women this and women that, there are genuinely all kinds of diverse women existing in this vast world. Refusing to be unfairly categorized, she passionately insists that she would have greatly preferred he admit his inability to trust her only after actually taking the requisite time to get to know her a little better first. Instantly regretting her impassioned outburst, a chibi-styled Faith claps her hands over her mouth in sheer, cartoonish panic as the prince stares down at her with wide-eyed astonishment. Spiraling into a frantic internal monologue about whether she said too much and if he will immediately divorce her, Faith is abruptly interrupted by the prince, who calmly dismisses her spiraling anxiety by stating that getting to know her is simply not necessary. Narrowing his sharp analytical eyes with supreme overconfidence, the royal arrogantly declares that he has long since thoroughly understood exactly what kind of person she inherently is. Resigning himself to the inescapable realities of his royal obligations, he closes his eyes wearily, accepting this turbulent marital dynamic as the unavoidable manifestation of his cursed fate. Turning his face away to conceal a cryptic, knowing expression, he seamlessly pivots the intense conversation toward the prevalent societal gossips surrounding her character. Delving into the malicious whispers of the royal court, he openly questions if she isn't exactly like the scandalous rumors suggest, audaciously challenging her husband so incredibly soon after their sacred marriage ceremony. A profound realization dawns on Faith's expressive face as she actively pieces together his convoluted logic, understanding that this widespread notoriety is precisely why he claimed there was absolutely no need to truly know her. Outside, a solitary bird rests peacefully on a lush branch as Faith, completely undeterred by his insults, incisively asks why he specifically chose her if he was already fully aware of those damaging rumors. Staring out the large, ornate window at the sprawling royal grounds, the prince reveals his calculated strategy, explaining that if you are a woman with an already bad reputation, absolutely no one will try to intervene or stop an impending divorce. Immersed in the oppressive shadows of his marital history, he laments that if this fifth wife is deemed a failure, the unforgiving public will inevitably think the previous 4 women were miserable failures as well. Processing the tragic depth of his systematic marital strategy, Faith solemnly acknowledges that for Lord Adelbert, this entire marriage assumes an inevitable divorce right from the very start. Lowering her long eyelashes in a moment of quiet vulnerability, Faith softly admits that she wasn't expecting anything genuinely affectionate from this arrangement either, yet a lingering sense of defiance remains. The heavy, emotionally charged silence between the newlyweds is abruptly shattered by the sharp, rhythmic knocking of a dedicated maid standing outside the towering, gilded double doors. Slipping her head respectfully into the room, the diligent maid politely pardons the interruption, formally announcing to the tense couple that the highly anticipated public presentation is finally ready. Adelbert's intense, multifaceted gaze locks onto his bride, his sharp features betraying a complex mixture of lingering doubt and unexpected curiosity regarding her next move. Keeping her face obscured beneath the delicate lace of her veil, Faith stands motionless as Adelbert issues his final, defining ultimatum, pointedly asking her what she will ultimately choose to do. Offering her a definitive, fleeting chance at freedom, he explicitly warns her that if she is genuinely going back to simply being a viscount's daughter, now is the absolute final time to flee. A subtle, dangerous smile slowly begins to curl at the very edges of Faith's lips, signaling a fierce internal transformation from a passive victim into an active, willing participant in this grand royal charade. Turning her back to him in a stunning display of majestic elegance, her long veil dramatically catching the ambient light, Faith definitively rejects his offer of retreat with a single, resounding no. Looking back over her shoulder with eyes blazing with unbreakable determination, she firmly declares she has no intention of turning back, as she possesses her own heavy burdens to bear. Fully embracing the deceptive nature of their transactional relationship, Faith cleverly throws his own cynical words back at him, reminding him of what he had claimed just moments earlier. With a voice dripping with newfound, intoxicating confidence, she specifically references his deeply held belief, rhetorically asking if he hadn't firmly stated that there isn't a single woman alive who doesn't constantly lie. Radiating an utterly breathtaking, theatrical charm, Faith flashes a dazzling, picture-perfect smile and gracefully promises that even if it's entirely a lie, she will flawlessly smile just for him. Utterly paralyzed by her breathtaking display of calculated bravado, Adelbert's eyes widen to their absolute limits, visibly shocked by the sheer, undeniable force of her unwavering resolve. A regal line of heavily decorated royal guards raises their shining brass trumpets, blowing a triumphant, resounding fanfare to officially herald the highly anticipated emergence of the new royal couple. As the majestic brass notes echo across the vast courtyard, the massive, tightly packed crowd of citizens erupts into a deafening, euphoric roar of absolute celebration. The massive, ornate glass doors leading to the grand balcony finally swing open, releasing a beautiful flock of pristine white doves into the sky as a symbol of peace and new beginnings. Below, the diverse, jubilant masses stare upward with wide, starry-eyed reverence, entirely captivated by the flawless, manufactured fairy tale unfolding before them on the royal balcony. A close-up reveals the polished, dark boots of Lord Adelbert as he steps forward with steady authority. Adelbert and Faith stand side by side in their majestic wedding attire as delicate flower petals cascade around them. Zooming out, the newlywed couple stands on the grand balcony, presenting themselves to the public. A view from behind Faith's veiled head shows the massive, cheering crowd waving flags as flower petals drift through the air. Adelbert raises his gloved hand in a practiced, formal wave to acknowledge the gathered citizens. His face remains composed and faintly smiling as he gracefully performs his royal duties. Suddenly, Adelbert's sharp eyes catch a concerning detail in the crowd, prompting a silent exclamation of surprise. Unaware of his shift in demeanor, Faith smiles radiantly with her eyes closed, projecting the perfect image of a happy bride. Observing her flawless performance, Adelbert internally notes that she appears to be fulfilling her duty just as she promised, realizing she wasn't lying. However, his cynical nature quickly takes over, as he rationalizes that her perfect compliance is only temporary. Maintaining her bright smile, Faith opens her eyes and quietly observes that she can see every single face in the massive crowd below. Scanning the malicious expressions of the people, she painfully realizes they aren't here to celebrate, but merely came to gawk at the notorious Villainess. A crude voice from the aggressive crowd explicitly confirms her fears by shouting out and calling her the slut queen. The oppressive atmosphere thickens as the relentless jeering never stops, filling her ears with mocking laughs and cruel snickers. Standing right beside her indifferent husband, Faith internally laments that even amidst this intense public humiliation, she can't even ask him for help. The sheer scale of the hostile mob overwhelms her senses as she nervously thinks that she has never seen so many people gathered before. A sudden, terrifying panic grips her chest, causing her to suddenly realize with mounting dread that she can't breathe. Struggling against the suffocating anxiety, she desperately wishes to head back inside soon because the lack of air is becoming unbearable. To her surprise, Adelbert abruptly turns his back to the balcony and begins to walk away, prompting a confused reaction from Faith. Coldly dismissing the event, he states that their brief appearance is more than enough since the crowd is simply here for gossip anyway. An overwhelming wave of relief washes over Faith as she gasps a soft sound of gratitude and hurriedly prepares to follow him. Clutching her heavy dress, the distressed bride quickly follows her husband back into the quiet safety of the palace interior. Safely shielded from the public eye, a deeply relieved Faith clutches her chest and thinks about how glad she is that it is over. Catching her breath in the peaceful corridor, she is incredibly thankful that everything seemingly worked out without a major disaster. The tense silence of the room is dramatically punctuated by the sharp sound of the heavy double doors moving. Faith flinches violently as the grand doors firmly slam shut behind them, fully sealing them away from the vicious crowd. Stepping intimately close, Adelbert stands right behind his startled bride, his intense gaze fixed on her. Without a word, he gently takes hold of her trembling hands, creating a rare moment of physical connection between the newlyweds. Quickly breaking the tension, Faith nervously pulls away and stammers that the entire situation doesn't matter. Maintaining his icy, aristocratic composure, Adelbert explicitly states that he is grateful she conducted herself so admirably before the public. Stunned by this surprise compliment, Faith momentarily falters before gracefully replying that she is deeply honored by his praise. Later that evening, Faith sits elegantly in her chambers with a steaming, delicate cup of tea resting in her hands. Standing across from her under the moonlight, Adelbert coldly pivots the conversation back to the harsh boundaries he established earlier. Laying down his absolute terms, he warns that if she continues to behave appropriately, he will maintain no interest in her whatsoever. He callously instructs her to drink, have men, and do as she pleases, just as long as her scandalous affairs never go public. Watching him prepare to leave, Faith forces a polite, sarcastic smile and thanks him for being so incredibly thoughtful. Left alone with her tea, she reflects with biting irony that for a fleeting moment, she actually thought he might be genuinely kind. Adelbert confidently strides down a long, ornately decorated palace hallway, closely shadowed by an attentive servant. Outside, a pair of birds takes flight across the sky, symbolizing a fleeting sense of freedom beyond the palace walls. Pacing forward in silence, Adelbert's expression remains profoundly stoic and entirely unreadable. Unbidden memories of Faith's radiant public smile and her hidden, distressed expression flash intensely through his analytical mind. He quietly acknowledges to himself that his resilient new bride seemed a bit different from the terrible rumors he had previously heard. His sharp eyes narrow slightly as a rare flicker of doubt briefly penetrates his usually steadfast, cold resolve. Quickly catching himself, Adelbert shakes off the intrusive thought and resolves to ignore it, brushing it off as a bad habit of his. Hardening his defensive heart once more, he firmly decides that he wants as little to do with her as possible. His deep cynicism is rooted in heavy emotional scars, as he grimly admits that he has already been betrayed far too many times. Meanwhile, a group of scandalized nobles gossips about the gorgeous bride and the lovely ceremony while others nervously demand to leave. Hidden in the shadows, a mysterious woman with dark lips sneers maliciously, mocking the prince for marrying a country bumpkin. Cloaked in a dark floral hood, the sinister woman smirks wickedly and bluntly calls the royal a fool. Plotting her next vicious move, she specifically targets Faith Howard by name, wondering exactly what cruel things she should do to her. A commanding, unseen voice pondered the immediate fate of Faye Howard, questioning the next strategic move in this complicated royal arrangement. He carefully considered exactly what he should do with the enigmatic woman who now found herself at his complete mercy. Faye remained bowed incredibly low to the ornate, patterned floor, submitting entirely to the overwhelming royal presence standing directly above her. Prince Adelbert stepped through the grand doorway, momentarily taken aback by her deep and thoroughly unexpected display of absolute reverence. The blonde prince quickly regained his regal composure, his sharp, calculating eyes evaluating the unusual situation with a quiet but fierce intensity. Shifting to an earlier, more private moment, Knight Commander Brandt casually reclined in a floral chair and mockingly congratulated the prince on reaching his 5th consecutive marriage. Adelbert sharply chided Brandt for his blatant lack of decorum, reminding him that this was an exclusive sanctuary that ordinary knights could not simply waltz into, regardless of their shared childhood bonds. Flashing a distinctly wicked grin, Brant eagerly interrogated the prince about the true nature of his infamous new wife and her terrifyingly dark reputation. The blonde prince stood silently by the opulent window, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass with a heavy, burdened heart. The two lifelong friends shared a quiet, tense moment of reflection as they looked out over the sprawling kingdom they were both sworn to protect. Adelbert finally began to speak, attempting to rationalize the thoroughly bizarre and chaotic path his romantic life had ultimately taken. He brought the heavy crystal glass closer to his lips, deliberately hiding his true, exhausted emotions behind a carefully practiced and stoic royal facade. Conceding to his friend's relentless probing, he admitted he was likely just wearing a fragile mask of virtue since it was merely the first day of their scandalous union. Brant let out a highly exasperated sigh, clearly frustrated by the prince's continuous defensive deflections and general unwillingness to be entirely honest. The knight commander demanded to know why the prince didn't simply go public with his reasoning, noting that deliberately marrying a known villainess was a remarkably bold move for a royal. Leaning in with a painfully self-deprecating smile, Adelbert confessed that he had suffered the absolute worst luck with women since the very day he was born. He vividly recounted the total disaster of his first wife, a breathtaking beauty whose insatiable obsession with men led her to blatantly drag lovers straight into the sacred halls of the royal castle. His second bride proved to be equally catastrophic, acting as such an extreme and reckless spendthrift that she very nearly bankrupted the entire kingdom's treasury. The unending misery continued with his third partner, a legendary demon of a woman who became horrifically violent and physically abusive whenever her fierce temper was provoked. Rounding out his incredibly cursed romantic history, the fourth wife was a severe alcoholic who terrifyingly transformed into a completely different, erratic person the moment she touched a single drink. Adelbert gestured exhaustedly with his hand, emphasizing that his abysmal luck extended far beyond just his disastrous matrimonial choices. Flinging his arms up in total defeat, he wailed that every single maid and wet nurse they hired turned out to be a problematic thief who shamelessly pilfered the castle's precious valuables. He somberly explained that exposing the embarrassing truth would only result in airing the royal family's dirty laundry, which the general public would never believe anyway once the press sensationalized the entire ordeal. Settling back into his plush armchair, the weary prince stared blankly ahead as the immense weight of his royal burdens settled heavily onto his exhausted shoulders. Brant crossed his arms with a serious expression, solemnly agreeing that hiding the terribly embarrassing truth was ultimately for the best. Adelbert sorrowfully reiterated his tragic fate, concluding that he was simply born under an incredibly unlucky star when it came to any matters involving women. Abandoning all lingering hopes for true romance, he declared that he had no need for personal happiness as long as his beloved nation remained peaceful and its citizens were content. With chilling and absolute finality, the stoic prince stated that he was completely wed to his country and nothing else mattered. Staring out into the bustling reception hall, Adelbert coldly resolved that whether his new bride was a wicked villainess or a saint, he would simply use her as a political tool for the kingdom's ultimate benefit. Having steeled his internal resolve, the prince let out a quiet sigh and mentally prepared to face the grueling social obligations that inevitably awaited him. He acknowledged the bitter reality that, directly following the lavish wedding ceremony, he had absolutely no choice but to immediately face his many judgmental aristocratic guests. Moving into the grand reception hall, a dignified nobleman stepped forward to formally offer his sincere congratulations to Lord Adelbert and his new bride. Sitting stiffly on his ornate throne, the exhausted prince couldn't help but cynically think that watching nobles offer their congratulations for a fifth time must seem completely ridiculous to everyone involved. An elderly, heavily bearded nobleman respectfully bowed before the royal couple, murmuring his polite apologies for any perceived intrusion during the grand festivities. The royal announcer consulted his official guest list, suddenly hesitating with a highly nervous sound as his eyes landed on the next prominent name. Regaining his professional composure, the announcer loudly proclaimed the highly anticipated arrival of the esteemed house of Duke Black. The sharp, rhythmic clacking of elegant heels echoed ominously through the grand hall, instantly drawing the undivided attention of every single guest present. A stunningly beautiful woman with dark, meticulously styled hair and a magnificent Gothic dress made her incredibly dramatic entrance into the opulent venue. The surrounding noblewomen gasped in sheer awe, completely captivated by the newcomer's striking, almost otherworldly appearance. Onlookers openly marveled that such a gorgeous woman was to be expected in the capital, though one sharp-eyed man narrowed his gaze, feeling absolutely certain he had seen her breathtaking face somewhere before. Completely shattering the strictly formal atmosphere, a young boy suddenly yelled out, "Mother!" and joyfully rushed forward while offering his own innocent congratulations. Startled by the sudden commotion, the dark-haired aristocratic woman quickly turned around to face the rapidly approaching child. 5-year-old Matthew Rice beamed with absolute delight, excitedly confirming to the completely shocked crowd that the striking woman truly was his beloved mother. The mysterious woman's composed facade instantly melted into a warm smile as she happily greeted Matthew, tenderly asking if her precious son had been well during their long separation. Prince Adelbert's newest blonde bride stared in absolute, trembling disbelief, completely unable to mentally process the bizarre familial reunion unexpectedly unfolding right before her very eyes. Sweating nervously under the intense scrutiny, Adelbert stepped forward and offered a highly uncomfortable apology to the bewildered crowd for the terribly delayed introduction. The breathtaking woman gently embraced her young son, her expressive eyes softening with deep and genuine maternal affection. She held little Matthew incredibly close to her chest, creating a tender, deeply intimate moment that contrasted sharply with the scandalous royal rumors surrounding the family. With a heavy, reluctant sigh, Adelbert officially introduced the gorgeous newcomer to the stunned reception as Vera, his infamous and deeply chaotic first wife. Flashing a wicked, highly knowing smirk, Vera locked her piercing eyes with the nervous prince and slyly noted that it had indeed been quite a long time since they last saw each other. Faye gasped in sudden recognition, her eyes sparkling brightly as she realized she actually knew the stunning woman standing before them. Recalling a quiet afternoon spent embroidering, Faye remembered seeing the gorgeous woman's face featured prominently in the kingdom's newspapers. She stared at the striking newcomer in absolute awe, completely captivated by her overwhelming and undeniable beauty. Slumping heavily into his ornate throne, Prince Adelbert rubbed his forehead and let out a deeply exhausted sigh. He sharply reprimanded Vera, sternly reminding her of his strict previous orders that she was never to set foot in the castle again. The weary prince bitterly complained that every time he remarried, watching his new wife inevitably fly into a jealous rage made him deeply regret the entire ordeal. Vera coyly dismissed his frustration, prompting Adelbert to insist that while the Duke's presence was acceptable, she truly should have stayed behind. Gently holding young Matthew close, Vera smoothly explained that as the boy's birth mother, her daughter had firmly insisted on paying her respects to the newly crowned Lady Faye. Glaring darkly at the pair, the prince cynically thought to himself that both mother and daughter were nothing but a massive nuisance. Unfazed by his obvious hostility, the striking dark-haired woman merely offered a thoroughly smug and knowing smile. Faye blinked in genuine surprise as the intimidating former wife suddenly shifted her piercing attention directly toward her. Leaning in with an aura of dangerous elegance, Vera offered her seemingly polite congratulations on the royal marriage. Rather than feeling threatened, the innocent Faye blushed furiously, internally starstruck that such a breathtakingly beautiful woman had actually spoken to her. Beaming with genuine delight, the starstruck new bride warmly and sincerely thanked her predecessor for the kind words. Maintaining her coy facade, Vera slyly warned Faye that Lord Adelbert could be quite high-strung, mockingly asking the new bride to take good care of him in her stead. Faye smiled brightly and promised to fulfill her duties, while internally reminding herself that as a mere wife in name, she likely wouldn't need to actually care for him. The moment Faye cheerfully accepted the role, Vera's mocking smile instantly twisted into a terrifyingly dark and venomous scowl. Dripping with sheer condescension, the dark-haired woman openly wondered if the prince's new bride was simply foolish or just incredibly dense. She ruthlessly mocked the prince, noting that by his 5th marriage, this pathetic level of woman was apparently all he could attract. As Vera dramatically proclaimed how utterly mortifying she found this replacement to be, an enraged Adelbert furiously snapped at her to shut her mouth. The blonde prince gritted his teeth, his sharp features pulled taut with barely suppressed royal fury. Completely ignoring the mounting tension, Faye gracefully raised a hand and politely requested permission to speak. Maintaining her surprisingly pleasant composure, the new bride calmly stated that she truly didn't care what terrible things Lady Vera said about her supposed pathetic nature. Pausing for a brief moment, Faye's serene expression held entirely firm against the older woman's withering glare. Her voice suddenly sharpening with stern authority, Faye fiercely reprimanded Vera, declaring that utterly bad-mouthing a father right in front of his own young child was completely unacceptable. Hearing the new bride's fierce defense, little Matthew tightly closed his eyes and offered a firm, appreciative nod. A sudden gasp escaped Faye's lips as the horrifying realization of her own audacious outburst finally crashed down upon her. She immediately fell into a state of sheer internal panic, mentally cursing herself for recklessly blurting out far more than she ever should have. Rather than erupting in anger, Prince Adelbert let out a soft, highly amused chuckle at his new wife's utterly unexpected sheer audacity. Vera's eye widened to an impossible degree, completely blindsided by the staggering disrespect she had just been shown. The normally composed Villainess stood frozen in stunned silence, a dumbfounded sound barely escaping her parted lips. Her initial shock rapidly boiled over into a tempest of blinding, deeply offended rage. Completely losing her elegant composure, the furious first wife screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding to know exactly who this upstart thought she was. She viciously belittled Faye, screaming that it took unbelievable nerve for some lowly, backwater viscount's daughter to dare lecture her. Spitting venom, Vera shrieked that Faye was nothing but an incredibly easy replacement and that merely marrying into royalty didn't make her special. Shrinking back from the overwhelming verbal assault, Faye timidly lowered her gaze and formally apologized for speaking completely out of turn. Swiftly extending a protective arm to shield his trembling new bride, Adelbert sternly called out his ex-wife's name to immediately halt her rampage. He coldly ordered the dark-haired woman to cease distressing their young son, firmly demanding to know if she had already forgotten Faye's incredibly valid point. The blonde prince locked eyes with his chaotic former lover, his gaze utterly devoid of any lingering warmth or patience. Violently grinding her teeth together in absolute, bitter defeat, Vera reluctantly forced herself to admit that this humiliating confrontation was finally over. Breaking the heavy silence, little Matthew enthusiastically grabbed his father's pristine cape and happily declared it was time to go. As she turned to leave, the defeated Villainess cast one final, utterly unhinged glare over her shoulder that promised brutal future retribution. Faye flinched violently, her heart pounding wildly as sheer terror gripped her soul under the weight of that murderous parting glance. Sweeping out of the grand hall, Vera venomously muttered that she truly hoped the pathetic new bride would hopelessly struggle as much as she possibly liked. Regaining a sliver of her terrifying composure, she sharply commanded young Matthew to come along with her. Looking down at the innocent boy, she smoothly announced that he would be having a lovely private dinner with his mother tonight. Watching the chaotic family depart, Faye forced a highly nervous smile, desperately trying to reassure herself that this confrontation was ultimately for the best since little Matthew looked so happy. The exhausted prince stood completely motionless, watching the retreating figures with a heavy, unreadable expression, casting a long shadow over his features. His solemn, piercing eyes betrayed a profound sense of world-weariness as he silently processed the absolutely disastrous reality of his continuously cursed existence. Left entirely alone in the cavernous, opulent hallway, the newlywed royal couple stood in an incredibly awkward silence, their daunting future looming heavily before them. Exuding a serene confidence, Faith smiles warmly toward her silent, contemplative companion as she prepares to address the lingering tension from the day's earlier events. Bowing her head with profound, unyielding grace, Faith steps forward to formally and sincerely apologize for Vera's outrageous behavior. Utterly captivated by her diplomatic tact, the young ruler expresses his deepest gratitude, thanking her profusely and admitting he is incredibly grateful that she handled the volatile situation so gracefully. Observing the prince's subtle aversion and hidden feelings, a quiet, snickering voice notes the stark irony of the situation, pondering aloud that he still isn't very honest with himself, is he? Gently breaking the heavy silence to elaborate on her profound sense of systemic obligation, Faith candidly reveals to the prince that she simply thought about her overarching place in their complex world. Delving deeper into the harsh reality of her multifaceted responsibilities, she solemnly explains that she heavily considered her lifelong duty as a designated tool of the royal family. Envisioning a brighter, prosperous future for the kingdom, Faith joyfully visualizes a young boy running in a sunlit field, believing that watching over the healthy growth of Prince Matthew, their future king, might also be an immensely important part of her work. Struck by the profound selflessness and unexpected depth of her unwavering dedication to the crown, the prince's eyes widen in sheer, unadulterated shock. Radiating a reassuring, angelic warmth, Faith freely admits she was worried she might have overstepped her political bounds, but cheerfully concludes that if she was able to help in any capacity, she is genuinely glad. Bidding him a peaceful and restorative good night, she politely urges him not to hesitate to let her know if there is absolutely anything amiss. Having delivered her earnest, heartfelt sentiments, the elegant princess turns her back and begins her quiet, dignified departure away from the stunned royal. Left entirely breathless by her sudden departure, the prince stares intently after her retreating figure while clutching his chest, clearly wrestling with a torrential flood of newly awakened emotions. Shrouded in the ethereal, sparkling glow of the corridor, Faith gracefully strides away, the magnificent, flowing layers of her resplendent gown trailing like a silken waterfall behind her. Piercing through his previous veil of stubborn hesitation, a newfound, desperate resolve aggressively hardens the young man's strikingly handsome features. Propelled by a sudden, magnetic urge he can no longer suppress, he silently prepares to aggressively close the vast physical and emotional distance separating them. Hastening his panicked pace down the opulent, shadow-draped hallway, the prince urgently pursues the retreating silhouette of his newly appointed consort. Cutting through the tranquil silence of the corridor with desperate speed, his gloved hand aggressively shoots forward to forcibly bridge the rapidly expanding gap. Firmly yet surprisingly gently, his outstretched fingers decisively envelop hers, completely halting her graceful departure in its tracks. Startled by the sudden physical contact under the glowing moonlight, Faith abruptly spins around, uttering a bewildered, "Huh!" as her wide eyes meet his intense gaze. Frozen in a state of mild shock, she stares down at their intertwined hands, completely mesmerized by the unexpected boldness of his restraining grip. Visibly flustered yet resolute in exploring the most important duty of a princess consort, the prince looks down at her with wide, incredibly vulnerable eyes. Caught entirely off guard by his breathless vulnerability and sudden physical proximity, Faith observes him with a mixture of polite confusion and tentative curiosity. Standing absolutely still in the grand hallway, the two royals remain locked in a tense, emotionally charged tableau as he stubbornly refuses to relinquish her delicate hand. Frantically searching for the exact right words to justify his impulsive action, he lets out a quiet gasp and awkwardly stammers an uncertain "th." Patiently awaiting his long-overdue explanation, Faith gently prompts him, softly inquiring what he was about to say. Mortified by his own embarrassing lack of forethought, he covers his mouth in a panic, mentally screaming to ask himself why he stopped her while awkwardly muttering that it's just, well. While she watches him with a perplexed, "Oh," a sudden, brilliant flash of inspiration violently strikes his panicked mind, prompting an internal, victorious shout of, "That's it." Summoning every last ounce of his fractured courage, he loudly and awkwardly blurts out a spontaneous invitation, asking if she would like to join him for dinner. Rapidly piling on unnecessary justifications to mask his sheer desperation, he babbles that since she isn't used to life in the castle yet, and it's still her first day despite being free outside official duties, he thought they could at least share a meal. Attempting to dial back his overwhelming intensity with a soft, nervous chuckle, he gently adds that she is entirely welcome to refuse his impromptu offer. Instantly dissolving his crippling anxiety with her characteristic warmth, Faith enthusiastically accepts the offer, declaring she'd be absolutely delighted to join him. A profound wave of relief immediately washes over his flushed face, his tense shoulders visibly dropping as he realizes she hasn't rejected his clumsy olive branch. Softly transitioning from awkward suitor to courteous host, he gently adjusts his grip on her delicate fingers and whispers, "Then." Beaming with a radiant, cooperative yes, Faith happily allows the still blushing prince to proudly lead the way down the corridor. Anticipating the highly esteemed arrival of the noble couple, a meticulously organized line of dignified servants stands at unwavering attention within the opulent dining hall. With practiced, theatrical flair, a gloved servant dramatically lifts the gleaming silver cloche to reveal the evening's mysterious culinary masterpiece. Completely overwhelmed by the lavish presentation, Faith's face flushes a deep crimson as she stammers, "Foi." "And what?" in utter, paralyzing disbelief. Staring transfixed at the decadent spread before her, she marvels at the sheer luxury, breathlessly wondering if this magnificent offering is actually meat. Comparing this unbelievable banquet to her previously meager existence, she realizes with a profound shock that this is absolutely nothing like yesterday's meals. Her wide, sparkling eye completely dilates, powerfully reflecting an infinite universe of pure, unadulterated gastronomic wonder. Unable to contain her ravenous curiosity for even a second longer, she eagerly dives in and takes a massive, delightful munch. Squeezing her fists in a state of absolute culinary euphoria, Faith gleefully shouts that it's too delicious, frantically wondering what this incredible dish could possibly be. Utterly lost in the rapturous joy of her extravagant dinner, she happily continues to munch away with a blissful, heart-filled expression. Panicking at her adorably feral consumption, the frantic staff exclaims, "Awawawa," while clarifying that this sparkling dish is merely the consommé soup of a vast course meal, to which she bashfully admits she totally thought that was the end. Continuing to romantically fixate on the magnificent broth, Faith gazes at it with sheer reverence, happily noting how the soup is surprisingly sparkling so brilliantly. Without warning, the joyous atmosphere shatters as a sudden, violent thump aggressively seizes her chest, completely arresting her breath and breaking her focus. Hearing her sudden distress over the rhythmic, painful throbbing of her heart, the prince instantly turns toward her, his face clouded with immediate concern. Misinterpreting her sudden physical faltering, the anxious prince quickly leans in to ask if the extravagant meal is somehow not to her liking. Frantically waving off his culinary concerns with an "oh no," Faith desperately assures him that the food is indeed delicious, but there is a deeper, hidden issue. Lowering her gaze in a sudden wave of melancholic shame, she timidly confesses that she feels terribly guilty indulging like this when she was actually thinking about something vastly more important. Gazing warmly at her lavish meal, Faith silently wishes her mother, father, and everyone back home could enjoy this incredible feast too. Observing her reaction, the prince thoughtfully points out that her homeland, the Howard territory, is situated out west on barren mountain land and isn't very prosperous. Realizing his sharp intuition, Faith gasps in surprise as he directly asks if her domain requires financial aid. Closing her eyes in somber reflection, she softly denies the assumption with a quiet refusal. Setting down his silverware with a sharp clink, the prince listens as Faith explains that their farmland remains diminished from a massive flood 2 years ago, prompting her to formally request royal assistance. Looking him dead in the eye, Faith boldly admits she decided to marry into the royal family purely because she thought she could be of some use to her struggling homeland. Continuing her earnest plea, she desperately hopes they could at least cover the crucial costs of flood control and land restoration. Slamming his hands on the table in sudden fury, the prince glares at a shocked Faith and coldly declares that she is that kind of woman after all. Startled by his sudden hostility, Faith nervously stammers out a broken apology. Turning his back and wrapping his thick cape around his shoulders, he sharply cuts her off, coldly stating that he understands exactly what she is trying to say. Staring up at his retreating figure, Faith utters a confused gasp as the harsh reality of his sudden mood shift sets in. With a heavy thud, the grand dining room doors slam shut behind him, leaving the young princess entirely alone. The grand, opulent royal bedroom sits in an eerie, stifling silence, amplifying the heavy isolation of her new life. Clutching her head in absolute despair, Faith agonizingly realizes that she really messed up this time. Tapping her fingers nervously, she laments making such a presumptuous request on her very first day, crying out that she is supposed to be a wife in name only. Gripped by a terrifying vision of her people suffering under a dark shadow, she frantically wonders if her misstep means everyone will stay poor for the rest of their lives because of her. Sweating with mounting panic, she clutches her chest and desperately asks herself if she can even make up for this catastrophic blunder. Recalling his bitter words about her being the kind of woman he despises, Faith turns to a nearby maid and wonders aloud if something terrible happened with his previous wives. Liza, a strict 55-year-old maid, observes the young princess with a sharp, judgmental stare. Fidgeting nervously under the intense scrutiny, Faith timidly asks Liza if she knows exactly why the prince divorced his past spouses. Liza silently decides that Faith is just another wicked woman chasing rumors, coldly stating she has no obligation to share royal secrets with someone who will just be divorced anyway. Turning her back with sheer disdain, Liza sharply tells the princess that the prince's past isn't something she needs to know. Offering a strained, self-deprecating smile, Faith humbly agrees that a mere tool for the royal family has no right to pry into his history. Dismissing the emotional conversation entirely, Liza firmly announces that it is time to get ready. A wave of confusion washes over Faith's face as she nervously questions if they weren't already done for the day. Meanwhile, in a grand, dimly lit study, the prince sits completely isolated behind his massive desk. He rubs his head in deep frustration, bitterly reflecting on Faith's blatant request for financial support for her territory's flood control projects. Paranoia spirals in his mind as he envisions his funds being maliciously drained, terrified that her demands will keep escalating until she bankrupts the entire country. Staring out into the empty room, he exhaustedly admits that constantly suspecting people is draining, trying to convince himself it's good he learned of her ulterior motives early on. Burying his face in his hand, a profound sense of weary regret visibly washes over his strained features. He silently agonizes over his own harsh reaction, feeling the bitter sting of guilt after saying such awful things to her himself. Flashing back to the disastrous dinner, he remembers coldly telling her not to trust women and reminding her that she is nothing more than a tool to preserve their dignity. Trying to bury his emotional turmoil, he stubbornly resolves to throw himself into his paperwork for the rest of the night. Suddenly, an exhausted, disheveled man leans heavily over his desk, surprising the working prince. Narrowing his eyes with sharp annoyance, the prince demands to know what the intruder is doing while he has urgent work to finish. The frantic man ignores the irritation and insists that the prince has far more important duties to attend to right now. Completely caught off guard by the vague, urgent interruption, the prince stares blankly and utters a confused sound. Standing nervously outside the prince's chamber, Faith hesitates quietly by the ornate, heavy door. Squeezing her hands together in a tense grip, she nervously prepares herself for the difficult confrontation ahead. With a resounding clack, the heavy metal door handle suddenly turns. The door bursts open as the disheveled man is violently shoved out by the prince, who angrily yells at him not to follow him anymore. Massaging his temples with a heavy sigh, the prince expresses sheer relief that the annoying man is finally gone. Standing just a few feet away, Faith nervously stutters out a greeting to grab his undivided attention. The prince instantly freezes, his eyes widening in complete shock at the sudden sight of his new wife. Meeting his stunned, breathless gaze, Faith softly admits that she has been waiting for him. A quiet gasp escapes his lips as he takes in her unexpected presence outside his quarters. Tears threatening to spill from her eyes, Faith trembles as she admits she knew these difficult duties would come with marriage. Standing awkwardly in his robe, the prince listens silently while she internally berates herself for angering him when she is merely a token consort. Hesitantly fidgeting with her hands, she desperately tries to figure out what she should do right now to fix the growing rift between them. Bowing her head in deep submission, Faith sincerely apologizes for making such a rude and presumptuous request earlier in the evening. Staring in wide-eyed, sweating shock, she listens helplessly as he flatly insists that everything is perfectly fine. The stoic, light-haired man gazes back at her panicked expression with an incredibly intense, unreadable silence. Crossing his arms defensively, he admits it is a profound relief to marry someone with their own hidden motives. He solemnly confesses that he was actually the first to suggest becoming a mere political tool for the royal family. Gazing up with lingering anxiety, she softly interrupts his speech to insist that she is the one who truly needs to apologize. Acknowledging her immense guilt, she tearfully agrees and notes that Liza must have fiercely forced him into this miserable arrangement. She agonizingly recalls the harsh, demanding voices declaring that a consort's most critical duty is to bear children. The painful memory burns as she remembers being told to at least bear a child first, even if a divorce is inevitable. Turning abruptly away with a sharp rustle of fabric, he gently reassures her not to worry about the cruel gossip of others. He firmly promises that those relentless meddlers will undoubtedly give up their pressuring soon enough. Desperately lunging forward, she forcefully grabs his hand to halt his sudden retreat. Her delicate, trembling fingers tightly envelop his much larger hand in a remarkably urgent, unyielding grip. He jolts backward with a sharp, surprised gasp, his eyes widening in complete shock at her bold physical contact. Bowing her head with tearful determination, she declares she has been prepared for this heavy physical burden since the moment she decided to marry. She bravely vows to endure whatever intimate sacrifices are required if it will ultimately benefit the kingdom. Their intense, unwavering gazes lock in a profound, silent exchange of unspoken emotional burdens and heavy royal responsibilities. Slowly yielding to her surprising resolve, he firmly tightens his grip and warmly squeezes her trembling hands in return. His initially harsh, guarded gaze gradually melts into a look of deep, reluctant understanding as he fully absorbs her tragic sacrifice. Swiftly shattering the somber, heavy mood, he mutters a quick transition and gives her delicate arm a sudden, decisive yank. Sweeping her effortlessly into a highly romantic bridal carry, he leaves her gasping in wide-eyed astonishment amidst a sudden flurry of dramatic, glittering sparkles. He gently and carefully lowers her bewildered form onto the lavish bedsheets, his floral robe draped elegantly over his sturdy, imposing frame. Pinning her completely beneath his broad shadow as the heavy mattress groans, he leans in uncomfortably close while her beautiful face flushes a bright, burning red. Peering intensely into her wide, panicked eyes, he softly and deeply questions if she is truly certain about committing to this irreversible path. Completely overwhelmed by his extreme physical proximity, she violently yanks the thick blanket over her blushing face with desperately trembling hands. She lets out a sharp, ragged breath into her palms as sheer panic and immense embarrassment fully consume her frantic mind. Squeezing her eyes shut in sheer terror, she sharply hyperventilates while desperately trying to convince herself that she will somehow survive this ordeal. Frantically clutching her heavily flushed cheeks with her jewel-adorned hand, she sweats profusely as her nervous anxiety rapidly approaches an absolute breaking point. He quietly pauses his aggressive advance, silently observing her total, chaotic meltdown with a relaxed, slightly parted mouth. Pulling back to grant her vital space with a gentle rustle of his expensive clothing, an unexpectedly warm and deeply reassuring smile graces his handsome features. He gently instructs her not to push herself past her mental limits, prompting her to stutteringly and unconvincingly deny that she is forcing herself. Flashing a brilliantly serene smile, he calmly assures her that everything is perfectly fine because he holds absolutely no intention of fathering any more children. Her tear-filled eyes blow incredibly wide in complete, absolute bewilderment as she lets out a sharp squeak of total confusion. Sitting back lazily upon the bed and looking down solemnly, he declares that the powerful house of Riai's already having Matthew as an established heir is more than sufficient. He cynically reasons that if a new son were miraculously born, it would inevitably ignite a vicious, bloody clash between the ambitious mothers over the royal succession. She hesitantly argues that maximizing children is ideal, yet she openly admits his strategic reasoning regarding the succession does hold significant merit. He firmly counters that, given the heavy political burden of the recent divorce, he strictly wants to focus all his energy on raising Matthew properly for now. Staring silently at his composed profile with large, shimmering eyes, a profound wave of immense relief and tender admiration slowly washes over her delicate features. She marvels deeply within her own mind at his remarkably noble demeanor, completely moved by the unexpectedly kind expression resting upon his regal face. Bowing softly to his incredibly wise and compassionate judgment, she quietly whispers her absolute understanding of their fragile political situation. Smiling brightly with genuine gratitude for his thoughtful consideration, she formally accepts the unique circumstances and gracefully declines her intimate duties as his wife. He casts a quiet, entirely unreadable glance back over his broad shoulder at her peacefully seated, immensely relieved form resting on the bed. His initially sharp, commanding eyes subtly melt into a deep gaze of melancholic, quiet affection as he carefully studies her newly found innocence. Snatching a heavy book with a loud rustle, he announces he has urgent work to finish and gently commands her to go ahead and sleep. Adopting a highly polite, dismissive tone, he officially declares that he shall now retire for the long evening. Turning his rigid back to the soft ambient light, he gently acknowledges that the incredibly chaotic events of the passing day must have been quite overwhelming for her. Lingering near the shadowy doorway with a softened gaze, she quietly absorbs his final, deeply caring instruction to get some much-needed rest. Surrendering completely to her overwhelming exhaustion, she sighs a soft affirmative and sinks deeply into the luxurious, heavily draped canopy bed. Meanwhile, he sits entirely alone at a shadowy wooden desk, reading crucial documents by the warm flicker of a single oil lamp while wearing a profoundly serious expression. He silently and passionately vows to do his absolute best, bearing the crushing political weight of duty for the ultimate prosperity and safety of the country. He suddenly flinches violently with a sharp gasp, whipping his blonde head around toward the massive bed as an unexpected sound shatters his intense concentration. He discovers her slumbering deeply against the plush pillows, a remarkably tranquil and exquisitely soft expression completely relaxing her lovely features. Observing her entirely unguarded vulnerability from afar, he silently notes with a distinct mixture of fond amusement and warmth that she sleeps exactly like an innocent child. Narrowing his sharp eyes in profound, highly conflicted contemplation, he internally questions if this unbelievably peaceful, gentle woman could truly be the terrible villainess the royal rumors claim. The pale, quiet morning light begins to softly filter through the massive window panes, perfectly illuminating her serene, deeply asleep form elegantly reflected in the ornate vanity mirror. His tired, strained eyes droop slightly as an intensely complex wave of lingering suspicion, deep doubt, and blossoming affection violently clashes within his analytical mind. Staring intensely into the quiet, heavily shadowed darkness of the royal bedchamber, he wonders aloud if this strange, fragile trust rapidly blossoming between them is finally what people truly call faith. The heavy door creaks open as someone gently pushes their way inside. A cheerful voice breaks the morning silence, asking if the occupant has finally awakened. Blinking away the grogginess, heavy eyelids flutter open to the soft sound of a plop. The visitor notes his perfect timing and warmly invites the man to help himself. A beautifully prepared tray is gently set down, leaving him staring in quiet disbelief. Looking up at the brightly smiling woman, he asks if she personally prepared this meal just for him. She cheerfully explains that she consulted the kitchen after learning he only ever survives on tea and biscuits after working until dawn. Startled by her dedication, he apologizes for the staff's surprise and asks if she truly went all the way to the kitchen herself. Laughing off his concern, she brightly declares that she simply cannot stand idling around after waking up. Lowering his gaze to the steaming cup, he softly acknowledges her effort with a quiet murmur of understanding. Staring at the porcelain rim, he stubbornly reminds himself that he absolutely will not be won over by a single cup of tea. Despite his internal reservations, he raises the delicate cup to his lips and takes a steadying sip. Softening his guarded demeanor, he sincerely thanks her, admitting that no wife has ever shown him such genuine consideration. Beaming with absolute joy, she clutches the serving tray as the grand estate looms beautifully in the background. Later that night, the couple formally descends the grand staircase of the mansion to greet their assembled guests. Standing confidently beside his radiant wife, Lord Faith raises a hand to thank everyone for gathering in their honor. Crystal goblets clink harmoniously through the hall as the attendees raise their drinks in a unified cheer. An imposing, beautifully sculpted stone angel watches silently over the extravagant floral decorations of the ballroom. Mingling seamlessly with the aristocratic crowd, Lord Faith engages in polite conversation with the surrounding nobles. The festive atmosphere shifts when a sharply dressed man leans in to urgently whisper a pardon to Lord Adelbert. Looking flustered by the sudden interruption, the young wife nervously apologizes to Lord Faith and promises to step out for a moment. Gathering her elegant skirts with a soft rustle, she slips away from the suffocating center of attention. Surrounded by intimidating silhouettes, she panics over how these high-status elites must despise bowing to a lower-ranking noble from House Howard. Enduring the harsh, judgmental whispers of the crowd, she laments that she fully expected to be treated this poorly. A familiar, chilling voice suddenly cuts through the tension to greet Lord Faith, freezing her completely in her tracks. Her pupils shrink into pinpoint dots of absolute terror as a dreadful realization washes over her face. A sinister speaker mocks her visible panic, asking if she has already forgotten the face of her former fiancé.